Do not enter Blackthorn Woods.
It began with a dare whispered between friends on a late September night, when the air was already touched with the chill of coming winter, the kind of night when silence feels heavier than sound, and the wind in the trees carries voices that are not quite your own. Daniel, who always carried himself with a kind of reckless pride that made him the center of every gathering, leaned back in his chair with a grin that never reached his eyes and said he had heard of a cabin deep in Blackthorn Woods, a place that children whispered about and adults pretended not to know, a place where people swore the trees grew too close together as if trying to keep the cabin from being seen. Rachel, sharp-eyed and never willing to let Daniel's confidence go unchallenged, asked if he was scared to prove it existed, and Daniel smirked as if fear was something that belonged to others but never him. Marcus, quieter than the rest and always the reluctant follower, tried to laugh it off and said the stories were old legends told to keep kids from wandering too far, but even as he spoke, his hands fidgeted with the beer bottle in front of him. And then there was Claire, whose silence carried more weight than any of their jokes, because she was the one who always seemed to notice things before anyone else. And when Daniel suggested they should all go find the cabin that night, it was Claire who stared at him the longest before nodding slowly, as if something in her had already decided the outcome. They packed flashlights and a couple of blankets into the back of Daniel's Jeep, and though laughter filled the car, none of them noticed how quickly it died once the headlights cut into the edge of Blackthorn Woods. The trees loomed like ancient guards standing shoulder to shoulder, their bark blackened by time, their branches twisted into shapes that caught the light and made them look like grasping hands. Daniel drove until the dirt path gave way to roots that clawed through the soil, and then they walked. 4 figures swallowed by the forest, their breath turning white in the air, as if the cold there was not the same as the cold outside. The forest grew stranger with every step, the path narrowing into little more than deer trails, the silence so complete that even the crunch of their boots on the leaves felt intrusive. Marcus muttered that they should turn back, that it was already late and they could always come again in daylight. But Rachel snapped at him to quit whining, her voice trembling slightly, though she tried to mask it with bravado. Claire walked a little apart from the others, holding her flashlight low so that the light skimmed across the ground. And she said softly, almost to herself, that the woods looked different here, as if they had shifted since the last time anyone walked through them. They found the cabin when none of them expected it, standing crooked between the trees, as though it had been forgotten by the world itself. The roof sagged under the weight of moss, the wood was blackened with age, and the windows were nothing more than hollow squares of darkness. The air smelled faintly of rot. Not the natural rot of forest soil, but the kind that clings to places left to decay, places where time moves differently. Daniel laughed, a little too loudly, and said there it was, proof that the legends were nothing more than a shack in the woods. Rachel raised her phone to take a picture, but the screen flickered as though the battery were dying, even though she had charged it that afternoon. Marcus stood frozen a few steps back, his breath coming faster now, his eyes fixed on the cabin door that was slightly ajar as if it had been waiting for them. Claire whispered that someone had been here recently because the leaves at the threshold were disturbed. And though the others tried to brush it off, none of them could explain why the air inside the cabin looked darker than the night around them. Daniel pushed the door open, and the sound of the hinges echoed far louder than it should have, carrying through the trees like a scream muffled by distance. Inside, the air was colder still, heavy and damp, and their flashlights cut across broken furniture. A collapsed chair, shelves warped with moisture, and in the far corner, a stone fireplace choked with ash. The walls were covered with scratches, not the random marks of age, but lines etched deliberately, some vertical, some horizontal, forming shapes that made no sense. Rachel said it was just vandals, teenagers trying to make it creepy, but her voice cracked as she said it. Marcus refused to step inside at all, standing in the doorway like someone who knows a line should not be crossed. But Daniel mocked him and told him not to be such a coward. Claire crouched by the floorboards where the wood looked darker, almost stained, and she touched it lightly with her fingertips before recoiling as if it were wet, though nothing was visible in the light. Then Rachel found the mirror. It leaned against the wall near the fireplace, its glass cracked in the center, its surface so dust-coated that it reflected almost nothing. She wiped at it with her sleeve, and for a moment her face looked back at her, pale and stretched thin, But then she froze because her reflection did not move when she pulled her hand away. Daniel laughed and said it was just a trick of the cracks. But when he looked, the reflection that stared back at him did not match the grin on his face. It was subtle, just enough to unsettle, and they tried to laugh it off. Yet none of them wanted to stand too close to the glass. Marcus swore under his breath and begged them to leave, his voice rising in panic. But Daniel turned toward him with anger, asking if he wanted to be the reason they wasted the night. The air seemed to shift then, as if the cabin itself had exhaled, and the door behind them slammed shut without anyone touching it. Rachel screamed, the sound sharp in the confined space, and Claire whispered that they were not alone. Their flashlights flickered all at once, plunging them into darkness so complete that for a second none of them dared move, and when the beams came back, the scratches on the walls seemed deeper, newer, almost as if they had been carved while they stood there. Marcus pounded at the door, but it would not open, his fists echoing like drums against the wood, and Daniel cursed, shining his light across the room only to find the mirror had shifted slightly as if someone had pushed it forward. Claire's eyes widened, and she said in a trembling voice that she saw someone else in the reflection, someone standing between them, though the space in the room was empty. A shadow moved across the glass, taller than any of them, its head bowed as if it were watching, its limbs too long, its body slightly bent like a marionette with broken strings. Rachel dropped her flashlight and it rolled across the floor, spinning light into the corners where the darkness swallowed it too quickly. Daniel shouted at the figure to show itself, but his words sounded hollow, as if the walls absorbed them. The shadow did not answer, but the mirror cracked further, a thin line stretching from corner to corner, and in that moment the air grew unbearable, heavy with a stench of iron and damp earth. Claire clutched Marcus's arm and said they needed to leave now, no matter what, but the door remained locked, and the only way out seemed to be the window where glass had long since fallen away. Daniel yanked it open and climbed through first, his voice calling them to follow, though the sound of his voice outside was strangely distant, as if carried from far away. Rachel hurried after him, cutting her arm slightly on the jagged edge of the frame, her blood dripping onto the sill. Marcus was next, his breath ragged, pulling Claire with him. But as she stepped through the window, she froze because she swore she felt a hand on her back, pushing her forward, a hand that was cold and real, though none of the others touched her. When they stumbled outside into the woods, the night felt different, the trees pressing closer, the air colder still, and Daniel was standing a few feet ahead, his flashlight beam shaking slightly, though he insisted he was fine. Rachel pressed her hand against her bleeding arm, muttering curses, and Marcus bent over, gasping as though the air had thinned. Claire did not look back at the cabin, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than the air, that the shadow in the mirror was now watching from the broken window, its outline faint but present, unmoving yet alive. The forest seemed alive around them, every rustle of leaves sharp enough to make them flinch, every shadow between the trees darker than it should have been. And though Daniel tried to keep walking as if nothing was wrong, his pace was quicker now, his flashlight darting from side to side, as if he expected something to leap from the undergrowth. Rachel muttered that it was all in their heads, that the cabin was just an old ruin and nothing more, but her voice quivered, and her hand pressed harder to the cut on her arm, as if she thought the blood might draw something toward her. Marcus kept glancing behind them, his face pale and drawn, and each time he looked back, he swore he saw movement, a figure slipping between the trunks just far enough away that the light never touched it. Claire walked last, her steps slower, and she whispered to herself that they should not look back, that the thing wanted them to notice it, and the more they acknowledged it, the closer it would come. They had only been walking for a few minutes when Daniel cursed loudly, his flashlight sputtering out and plunging him into darkness. He smacked it against his palm, but the beam refused to return, and Rachel shone hers toward him only for both lights to dim at once, flickering weakly as if the night itself was swallowing the batteries. The forest grew impossibly silent. No wind, no distant sounds of owls or insects, just the faint crunch of their own footsteps. Then, from behind them, came the sound of wood splintering, a long groaning crack, as if the cabin had shifted on its foundation, and Marcus whispered frantically for them to run. They broke into a sprint, the beams of their flashlights bouncing wildly, and the trees seemed to close in tighter, branches slapping their arms and faces, roots rising from the ground to trip them. Rachel stumbled and nearly fell, but Daniel caught her, dragging her forward, his breath harsh in the still air. Claire lagged behind, her chest aching as she tried to keep up, and when she dared a glance over her shoulder, she froze because the figure was there, no longer distant but only a dozen paces away, its tall frame moving with jerking motions like a puppet dragged on invisible strings, its face obscured by shadow. She screamed for the others to keep running, and though they surged ahead, her legs felt heavy as if the ground itself wanted to hold her in place. Marcus turned back for her, grabbing her hand, pulling her forward until they crashed through a patch of underbrush into a small clearing where the moonlight barely reached. They collapsed in the dirt, gasping, their flashlights dimming further until they gave only faint halos of light. Daniel cursed again and said they just needed to find the path, that once they reached the jeep everything would be fine, but none of them knew which way the path lay anymore. The trees all looked the same, twisted shapes blotting out the sky, their trunks crowding the edges of the clearing, like an audience waiting for something to happen. Rachel said they had to keep moving before that thing caught up, but even as she spoke, a sound came from the trees, a low scraping noise like claws dragging across bark. Marcus whimpered and covered his ears, rocking slightly as if he could block it out, and Claire whispered that the woods did not want them to leave, that they had stepped into a place meant to be forgotten. Daniel tried to steady his breathing, insisting they were fine, but his voice cracked, and in the weak glow of the flashlight his face was slick with sweat. Then the smell came again, that stench of iron and damp earth, stronger now, so strong it made Rachel gag. And out of the darkness at the edge of the clearing, a shape began to form. It was not the tall shadow they had seen in the cabin, but something crawling, something that moved on hands and knees, though its limbs were too long, its head lolling unnaturally, as if its neck could not hold its weight. The sound of bones grinding echoed as it dragged itself closer, and Daniel shouted for them to move. They scrambled to their feet and plunged back into the trees, the underbrush tearing at their legs, the ground uneven beneath them. But the crawling sound followed, relentless, gaining speed. Rachel cried out as something snagged her hair and yanked her backward, and she screamed as she felt icy fingers wrap around her ankle. Daniel grabbed her arm, pulling with all his strength, and for a moment it felt like a tug of war between them and whatever had hold of her. Then, with a sickening snap, the grip released, and Rachel stumbled free, sobbing, her voice hoarse as she begged them not to stop again. Claire looked back and caught a glimpse of pale hands retreating into the dark, the nails jagged and broken, the fingers bending at impossible angles. They ran until their lungs burned, until their legs felt like they would give out, and finally, they burst through into another clearing, this one wider, with a massive dead tree rising from the center like a blackened spire. The tree was hollow at the base, a gaping wound in its trunk, and carved all around it were the same strange markings they had seen on the cabin walls. Claire stumbled closer, shining her dying light over the carvings, and realized with horror that they were not random at all. They were names, dozens of them, scratched deep into the bark. Some fresh, some so old the wood had warped around them. At the very bottom, she saw 4 new scratches, the beginnings of names not yet finished. And when she shone the light closer, her stomach dropped because she recognized the letters of Daniel's name. She cried out for the others to look, but before she could speak further, the tree shuddered as though alive, and from the hollow came a sound like breathing, slow and heavy, filling the clearing with each exhale. Rachel backed away, shaking her head, saying over and over that they should not be here, that this was wrong. But Daniel stepped closer, as if pulled by something unseen. His eyes looked distant, unfocused, and when Claire grabbed his arm to stop him, his skin felt icy cold. Marcus begged him to snap out of it, to stay with them, but Daniel's lips parted, and he whispered something none of them understood, words twisted and guttural that did not belong to any language they knew. The hollow in the tree seemed to respond, the shadows inside shifting, and a hand reached out, pale and long-fingered, pressing against the edge of the trunk. Rachel screamed and pulled Daniel back, but he resisted, his face contorted with something between fear and fascination. Then the forest erupted with sound. From all around came whispers, dozens of voices layered over each other, calling their names, coaxing, pleading, mocking. The flashlights flickered violently, plunging them in and out of darkness, and in every flash of light more hands were visible, clawing their way out of the hollow, reaching toward them. Marcus collapsed to his knees, covering his ears, tears streaming down his face as he begged for it to stop. Claire grabbed his arm, trying to pull him up, but then Daniel wrenched free of her grip and stumbled toward the tree again, his eyes rolled back, his voice echoing with the same guttural words. Rachel shouted at him, but the whispers drowned her out, louder and louder, until the sound felt like it was inside their skulls, vibrating their bones. The last thing Claire saw before the flashlight in her hand went out completely was Daniel's figure pressed against the hollow, the pale hands wrapping around him, pulling him into the darkness, as if the tree itself had swallowed him whole. Rachel screamed his name, clawing at the trunk, but the wood closed as though it had never been open, leaving only the carved names, and Daniel's now stood at the bottom, complete. Rachel's scream echoed through the clearing until her throat tore raw, but the forest absorbed the sound as if it had never existed, leaving only silence and the low, rhythmic creak of the dead tree swaying without wind. Marcus staggered backward, his face white as chalk, mumbling that they had to go, that Daniel was gone, and if they stayed any longer, they would join him. Claire pulled Rachel away from the trunk, even as she clawed at the bark with bleeding fingers, her nails splitting, her sobs so broken they hardly sounded human anymore. The carvings glistened in the faint moonlight, the name Daniel etched so deep into the bark it looked burned there, and beneath it, fresh scratches had already begun to form, the letters of Rachel's name, faint but unmistakable. Rachel froze when she saw it, her body trembling violently, and she screamed at Claire to look, to see how it was coming for her next. Marcus cried out for them to run, his voice high with panic, and he bolted into the trees, crashing through the undergrowth without care for direction. Claire dragged Rachel after him, their flashlights long dead, the world around them painted only in silver moonlight and moving shadows that seemed to close in tighter with each step. The whispers followed them, weaving through the branches like threads of smoke, voices calling their names with the soft intimacy of lovers and the cruel delight of tormentors. Rachel stumbled, her legs giving out, and she begged Claire to leave her, to save herself. But Claire gripped her arm with desperate strength, refusing to let go. They caught up with Marcus in a narrow stretch of woods, where the trees grew so close together it felt like a cage. He was standing rigid, his body shivering, his eyes fixed on something ahead. Claire followed his gaze and saw the cabin again. It should have been miles behind them, yet there it stood in the dark, its sagging roof and broken windows unchanged, its door open wide as if welcoming them back. Rachel let out a wail that was half a sob and half a laugh, hysterical and broken, saying it had never let them leave, that they had been walking in circles while it guided them back. Claire shook her head, refusing to believe it. But when she turned behind them, the path they had come from was gone, swallowed by blackness so thick her eyes could not pierce it. Marcus whispered that he could see Daniel through the window. His voice was soft and awestruck, and when Claire snapped her head toward the cabin, she saw movement inside. A figure stood in the darkness, lit faintly by some glow that came from nowhere, its head bowed, its arms hanging loosely at its sides. At first, she thought it was Daniel, but as the figure stepped closer to the broken window, her breath caught in her chest. It had Daniel's face, but stretched thin, the skin too pale, the eyes too hollow, as if something else wore him like a mask. Rachel screamed his name and ran forward, but Claire caught her before she reached the cabin, dragging her back as the figure raised its head. The mouth opened impossibly wide, and from it came the same guttural words Daniel had spoken before, the sound vibrating through the trees, rattling the ground beneath their feet. Marcus fell to his knees again, covering his ears, sobbing, and Rachel thrashed in Claire's grip, begging to be let go, insisting that Daniel was calling her. Claire held her tighter, whispering frantically that it was not him, that whatever stood there was not their friend. The figure in the window tilted its head slowly, and the glow inside the cabin flared brighter, revealing dozens of faces behind it. Faces half-formed and shifting, their eyes black voids, their mouths opening and closing in unison with the whispers that filled the woods. The air grew colder still, their breath freezing in front of them, and the forest around them seemed to bend inward, the trees leaning closer, the ground sloping toward the cabin as if everything in Blackthorn Woods wanted them inside. Rachel broke free of Claire's grip with a sudden jerk and stumbled toward the door. Her voice cracked as she cried Daniel's name again. Claire lunged after her, but before she could reach her, the ground beneath Rachel split open with a sound like tearing flesh. Pale hands shot up, dozens of them, grabbing her arms and legs, pulling her down into the soil. Rachel shrieked, clawing at the earth, her eyes wide with terror. But the ground swallowed her whole in seconds, leaving only disturbed dirt and the faint echo of her voice. Claire froze, her heart pounding, unable to breathe, and Marcus let out a strangled cry, scrambling backward until his back hit a tree. He looked at Claire with wild, terrified eyes and whispered that they were next, that the forest would not stop until all of their names were carved into that tree. Then he screamed, a sound so raw it split the night, and his body was yanked sideways into the shadows. Claire saw only a blur of long limbs and pale fingers dragging him away, his hands clawing at the dirt as he vanished into the dark, his scream cut off abruptly as if swallowed. Now, only Claire remained. She stood trembling, her body numb, her mind blank with terror, the whispers louder than ever, pressing against her skull until it felt like her thoughts would burst. She staggered toward the cabin, unable to stop herself, her legs moving without her will, as if the forest itself guided her. At the threshold, she stopped, staring into the darkness where the mirror still stood, its cracked surface glowing faintly. Her reflection looked back at her, but it was not her at all. The face was twisted, the eyes hollow, the mouth curved into a smile she could not make. The reflection raised its hand slowly, pressing it against the glass, and Claire felt the cold against her own palm as though a barrier no longer existed. The last thing she heard before the darkness consumed her was her own name whispered from the trees, whispered from the cabin, whispered from within her own mind, until she could no longer tell where it came from. And in Blackthorn Woods, deep in the hollow of the dead tree, 4 new names glistened freshly carved into the bark. Their letters etched so deep, the wood wept dark sap like blood, and the forest grew silent once more, waiting for the next footsteps to wander too far inside.